I'm going to just begin by acknowledging that I am sitting. I live and work in Irriganji land. I'm at the Nomabata campus here in Cairns, and I can see that there are a few people, few of my other colleagues from this campus and also JCU's campus in and around Townsville. It is my pleasure once again to introduce one of our visitors. Our visitor no longer. Keyvan has made his way back to the Northern Hemisphere and is joining us from Jena. Keyvan was here as a Roderick Centre visiting fellow just a bit over a month ago, and that's a moment where I can acknowledge the generous contribution of Colin and Margaret Roderick to JCU, the Centre for the Roderick Centre for Australian Literature and Creative Writing is a centre that I am a part of. My colleague Elizabeth Smythe, who is with me. The director, Victoria Katainen, has sent her apologies for today. We're a small centre, but with that support from Colin Roderick, we're able to invite visitors from across Australia and even across the world. Keyvan Allahyari is a junior professor in global Anglophone literatures at the University of Jena. He's held the Marie Curie Postdoctoral Fellowship at the University of Oslo, the Humboldt Postdoctoral Fellowship at the University of Tübingen, the Friar Library Fellowship at the University of Queensland, and he was one of the emerging critics with an Emerging Critics Fellowship at the Sydney Review of Books a few years ago. He is the author of Peter Carey, The Making of a Global Novelist, and he's also the author of a forthcoming book, Liquid Objects, Abdul Razak Gurna and the Material Ecologies of Water. Keyvan writes about borders and waters, and we can see from the title of the presentation that we're about to listen to today that we will be engaging with those ideas and the challenges of coming to terms with those. Without further ado, Keyvan, I would like to invite you to join us and speak to us this afternoon on decolonial blues, water and the interdisciplines resource frontiers.
Thanks so much, Roger, for the kind introduction. I would like to say a word about the generous support of my research at the Roderick Centre too, and also the support for the ongoing interest in what I'm doing, including providing this space for talking about it. The month that I spent on both JCU campuses fall true to the idea of the fellowship very much. And in literal sense, this scheme brought me back and reconnected me with a wider cohort of Australian literary scholars in Cairns and Townsville, but across the country. So a huge thank you to my hosts, Victoria, Roger, and Elizabeth. My time in Cairns partly overlapped with the research stays of the Roderick Fellows Meg Brayshaw and Dashiell Moore. I'm grateful to both for fruitful conversations and great company. Thank you also to everyone else who's here today online or is listening to this talk asynchronically later. I begin by acknowledging the unceded sovereignty of the Bindal people, Yidinji people, and Jabugai people, on whose lands I conceived of this project and wrote part of the talk for today. They have always been and will forever be the rightful owners of these lands and their bodies of water. I pay my respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I'm conscious today. I'm conscious that I'm speaking from overseas, and that I was a visiting scholar at JCU, with all kinds of positional associations that go with both terms. I should say at the outset that I'm not speaking from authority. If anything, I'm coming from a place of reflection and awe. I arrived in Bindal country in early July with relatively clear ideas about my research. But as time went on, the lines in my head became blurrier, which I resisted in the beginning. But then I realized I had to trust the course that it was taking in the geography that I was inhabiting for the first time. I'd never been that far north. It was humbling to walk into the Mabo Library in Townsville on my first day, knowing that I was in a space in which Eddie Mabo worked towards overturning the legal myth of Australia's ownership. In fact, one of the aims of the Roderick Fellowship was to encourage research that could foreground regionality, and perhaps any attempt at research that derives inspiration from being on land is in some sense allowing the place to change what we're doing. In the past 2 decades, Blue Humanities has enjoyed a theoretical purchase on a wide gamut of liquid matter, from salt and fresh waters to vapor and ice, and an increasingly expansive geographical range. The subdiscipline has moved, as Stephen Mintz puts it, towards enlarging the field's normative baseline from the Anglophone North Atlantic to the global Pacific, a shift to the South in disciplinary compass and its attendant critical vocabulary. The imperative for entering Pacific waterscapes rings celebratory undertones of diversifying the discipline's reach into new terrains, farther as it gets from the purported Anglo-American center, with the potential outcome of presupposing an orientation towards human geographies, whose front line is precisely resisting the language and the logic of such cartographic tendencies. In other words, the theoretical vernacular of the blue hazards a false claim. As Alice Tapunga Somerville suggests, there has never really been an oceanic turn, because any turn posits a move towards oceanic bodies, presumably from somewhere outside of them. She writes in defiance that we have already been here in the Pacific, in Oceania, in Tuamotuai Akiwa, in the 1,200 overlapping oceans that simultaneously occupy this face of the globe, and not always in that order. Somerville's insistence on the precedence of indigenous being and knowing the ocean pokes at how the blue method mediates an old geopolitical parameter. In this scenario, the Pacific waters, or the idea of it, can become instrumentalized in the confluence of academic expertise, exposed to the zest for alternative spatializations of the world, without accounting for the relationship between disciplinary positions and their conjoined existence with the hegemony of the global capital. Other indigenous scholars have long maintained their suspicion of the Western academic ethnographic imagination about the region. Famously, Albert Wentz wrote in 1976 about the easy trap of what he calls the uncommitted gods of academia that impose their detached objective analysis on the region, but only in continuity of the imaginaries of conquest of the southern continent. In a similar manner, the late Teresa Taiwa warned of the enthusiasm that can dovetail into the lingering aura of academic knowledge of the Pacific, sugar-coated in the primacy of affiliations and the associated validity of a scholarly output. Nonetheless, the compulsion to move into southern waters instantiates the hope in the possibility of the separation of the colonized matter from the political apparatus through which this matter has reached us. And also the potential in discerning this distinction upon enunciating it. As an interdisciplinary exercise, the blue humanities draw on new materialist thought and area studies, at least that's how I think about it, informed by the currency of including the non-human in questions of vitality, agency, and generative capability, but also by the impulse to break open scholarship about regional literatures to globalist optics. This is something that in fact came up a lot in conversations with Megan Dashiell during my stay in Cairns as one of the ongoing problematics of Australian literary studies. In this juncture, water has become something of a methodological savior in literary humanities at large, often evoked as an element that can dilute some of the long-held scholarly fixations and expose the limits of disciplinary imaginaries. This promise, in turn, has proved very productive of its own glossary of fresh academic lexicon, from modernist liquidities to Bethnic imagination, brine aesthetics, ice humanities, hydromedia studies, black aquatics, pluvial forms, and blue architectures, and the list can go on. There is no surprise that this vantage point has generated a critical mass of interesting research worldwide. In Australia, too, this line of thought has been very generative. I've given a handful of examples of books in this slide, which is far from representative of the breadth of interventions that we have had in the country. Just to think of one of the early instances, I've included the book Fresh Water, New Perspectives on Water in Australia, edited by Emily Potter, Alison Mackinson, Stephen McKenzie, and Jennifer Mackay. The book brought together interdisciplinary essays about Australia's multifaceted relationships with the River Murray as a cultural, social, ecological, and a spiritual presence rather than merely a resource. And I think that book came out in 2007. So that's before sort of the rise of the establishment of blue humanities, subdiscipline at least. In Sydney and its waterways in Australian literary modernism, Meg Brayshaw examines how Sydney's harbour and estuary landscapes shaped the modernist imagination of significant writers such as Christina Stead, Eleanor Dark, and Kylie Tennant, and others. This is a particularly important intervention for bringing notions of urban ethics, social mobility, and settler imagination vis-a-vis the city's water-infused geography. To bring things home, Maxine Newlands and Claire Hansen, both of them JCU researchers, published an excellent volume of essays earlier this year entitled Critical Approaches to the Australian Blue Humanities. The volume presents a broad range of powerful interdisciplinary work by literary scholars, historians, anthropologists, artists, and writers in relation to multi-species justice, colonial undersea, indigenous ontologies, and pedagogical practices. The contributions are varied and all very impressive, so I apologize that I don't name them individually. Another book that I can think of is Reading Underwater Wreckage by Killian Keighley. Killian in this book is sort of taking the notion into what he calls in another recent piece a submersion in literary humanities, where he's doing very interesting and powerful interdisciplinary readings of various types of shipwrecks and objects. I was wondering today, though, if I could take this debate. Oh, sorry, I forgot to mention Loïli Eshrari's work, Indigenous Aesthetics and Knowledges for Great Ocean Renaissance. Loïli Eshrari is an interdisciplinary artist and writer and activist whose work is also sort of a cross between all these fields, and I think that's another kind of important intervention that's coming out of Australia at the moment. But I'm still processing the area of blue humanities, what I think of the place where it is, in terms of what Arjun Appadurai calls research imagination, as the outcome of the absorption of a certain geography of knowledge about what regions are and the ways that research itself can be a special practice of academic imagination about regionality. The blue of the globalist blue humanities, I think, can only operate safely with a non-normative and anti-colonial feel to it. This is to say, the blue humanities take water as an element with two broad associations. First, as one element that continues to enable imaginative and material domination of the colonial project. In the Australian context, this can simply mean that settlers arrived by way of water, controlled water resources, and have been barring people from entering the coastal borders of the nation state. The second association is that water is deemed to make the rigid colonial temporality less stable. That is, it contains properties to resist, limit, and re-envision less destructive futurities for the settlement. My hunch is that the coloniality of power in the Waterborne method, if we can formalize it as such, to appropriate Anibal Cuyano's term, risks relegating the regional geography to the affectations of disciplinary knowledge couched in vague emancipatory politics of the contemporary university. It's necessary here, though, to make a semantic distinction. Understand that using university, or worse, the university, capital U, as a catchword is rather problematic. I'm speaking here in solidarity with a large academic workforce, especially colleagues in the humanities, and the diligent involvement in scholarly and pedagogical care, and only in dialogue with the underlying corporate structures that are driving more of the academic workforce into precarious conditions of labor, including cuts to research schemes and increasing load of administrative work. But what I'm concerned with is the tension between doing research in the literary humanities that foregrounds water in the settler colonial Australia and at the university that is sitting in some kind of relation with the stolen water. And that's the kind of relation that I'm trying to dwell in as much as possible today. I want to argue here that to sustain the validity of water as a source of academic feeling in Australian waters in particular, it needs to be subtracted from its history of Australian waters and the very place of academic research to the history of that matter. And in here, regional Australia can offer us a very interesting insight in this kind of problematic. One thing that can make this relation more legible is the contemporary university's understanding of land as real estate, which stands in complete denial of Indigenous understandings of country. In his book, A Third University is Possible, Ian Paperson has talked about the centrality of the usurpation of Indigenous land for the establishment and the continuing survival of the university in the United States. Land, as he writes, is not only an early feature of the establishment of universities, rather it continues to be the defining trait of a competitive modern-day research institution that enables many of them to grow despite economic crises, declining enrollments, and overblown tuition fees. Paperson's intervention is based on the simple logic that universities are built on Indigenous land, which makes complete sense. But as an obvious point, I'd like to add that universities are also built on Indigenous water. Giving proper acknowledgement to how the university's materiality drapes over stolen water may have necessary imports for any critical engagements with the element. What happens, for instance, once we recognize that the university has literally drained and poured concrete over the wetland to build the physical environment necessary for its operation. Here, I have the University of Melbourne in mind, and that's where I started to think about the valency of water in literary scholarship. And that was some years back, right after finishing my PhD at Melbourne. And then even during my studies there, I had an interest in the history of the university as a structure. But looking at some images at the time, I was struck by so many pictures of the university where you could see that it was standing next to lakes or creeks, which raised the question for me at the time, where did the water go? Why is it that we have so much built environment and not so much of the water that were, in fact, in those sort of late 19th century, early 20th century pictures. Up until right around early 1940s, you can still see the lakes and the waterways. So in Victoria, streams and ephemeral water flows were systematically drained into underground pipe networks, which caused to erase them from the surface by the end of the 1800s. And that is in the first few decades into the life of the university. But what's interesting is that evidence suggests that despite the transformation of ecosystems, which has resulted in the original water streams to be piped underground, short-finned eels still regularly migrate from Victorian waterways, from the Bass Strait, through pipes under the university's main campus, and for another 3,000 kilometers into the spawning grounds in the Coral Sea. It's an epic migratory route that's still taking place underground. So for me, this necessitated staying with the modes of production of academic knowledge in the neoliberal university, but also in relation to its obsession with property. In other words, I became more and more interested in this sort of overlaying of existing temporalities, of different ways of telling a story of the land by the university and the very water and the waterways that it literally suppresses, and they exist at the same time on top of each other. If we are earnest about this, if we are earnest in saying that water is the basis of colonial disposition, then in this environment, we might start to feel differently about rehashing it as a theoretical device in university work and at the university. We might then get what I wanted to call the decolonial blues, feeling deflated when we come up against the presumption of our academic positions, exposed to the possibility that our academic habitus is shaped more by the concrete that houses us than the waterways that it suppresses. I'm thinking here in terms of a shift of attention from the color to the affect of blue humanities. Susan Fairweather has argued recently that the shift from green to blue in environmental humanities does not merely effect a change in focus, but revitalizes our understanding of color, materiality, and colonial histories. Blue, she contends, is deeply entangled with colonial exploitation and environmental transformation, but it is also capable of inspiring resistance and reconfiguration of colonial narratives. She calls for taking the question beyond the simplistic equation of blue with water oceans and seas to investigate what thinking with blue means in the blue humanities, and reckon with the coloniality of blue that informs its potential for present and future blue endeavors, right? But in this, she sees both kinds of potentials for it to become a tool for kind of a folding new liberal university, but she also sees it in terms of its potential for what she calls anti-colonial resistance that this scholar encourages. I'm curious about the extent to which the blue method can afford such resistance if it is pitted against its historical position as a resource frontier. Knowing that the frontier could only function as a result of the superimposition of a political ecology that appropriates indigenous waters and ecological knowledge, while simultaneously denying the sophistication of the cultures that produce that knowledge. Bruce Pascoe's book, The Dark Emu, has a long chapter on aquacultures, which is very significant and interesting about exactly this kind of question. So, how far can we sustain our attachment to the Waterborne method and the concrete, or in the concrete, as both the institutional raison d'etre and the literal denial of indigenous waterways, as well as migratory habits of non-human species? And how to account for this irony without risking the foundation of institutionalized critique to fall apart? Okay. So I'll continue sort of in some kind of roundabout response to those questions. In a letter dated 1st of April 1840 to George Augustus Robinson, the first so designated protector of Aboriginals, Edward Stone Parker, Robinson's assistant, reported the damage to the aquacultural systems of the Wurundjeri people, owners of the lands and waters around Birrarong, otherwise known as Yarra River in current-day Victoria. The letter reads, "The entire country of the Wurrung and Witturong tribes, with scarcely any exceptions, is now sold or occupied by squatters. A considerable portion of the country, ranged by the Jodjurong and Tawirongorong tribe, is also taken up by sheep or cattle runs. All available portions of the tracts that remain will speedily be absorbed in like manner by stock. The very spots most available to the Aboriginal people for their productiveness, the creeks, water resources, and rivers, are the first to be occupied." End of quote. Parker's letter connects the time of the occupation to the progressive encroachment on water resources. He writes these words only 5 years after the spurious claim of the notorious explorer John Batman on the purchase of 600,000 hectares of land in Victoria after his well-documented involvement in the Black War massacres in Tasmania. We'll come back to Batman a bit later. The first huts and farms were set up quickly afterwards when the ship Enterprise, owned by John Pascoe Faulkner, brought a party of free settlers from Georgetown in Tasmania to Port Phillip and up into Birrarong. The banks of the river, where the Shuna marooned, saw the emergence of a new settlement, which later became the city of Melbourne. The inherent futurity in Parker's syntax, "the first to be occupied," discloses, as he says, a matter-of-fact trajectory of the settler logic. It is bound to happen. The arrival of the new subject by way of water and towards water mobilizes this deterministic prospect, but only speedily As the squatter and his means of sustenance, the cattle, are presumed to replace the owners and their sophisticated practices of resource conservation and sustainable land and water management. Thinly disguised in Parker's dubious pastoral care, this historical implasticity propels the settlement into two opposing directions: for settlers to flourish and for the owners to diminish, marooned from the timeless human ecology of First Nation life. It is as if Aboriginal livelihood is already a thing of the past, conjugated in the grammar of colonial temporality. Occupied, he says, taken up, absorbed by settlers and the livestock. What betrays the letter's liable sense of history is its tonal totalitarianism, its emphasis on the comprehensiveness of the settlers' domination over indigenous ways of being in the world, and in connecting the control of waterscapes to an inevitable change of occupancy. Parker's focus on productiveness displays the ontological differences to indigenous thought, where water bodies are parts of a wider system of interconnected socio-physical relationships and identities outside of linear colonial temporalities. The occupation of water becomes a basis for perverse optimism, a dividing point that compels the endless aspiration of colonial settlement, while Western legal notions of property ownership, what Virginia Marshall has called aqua nihilius, activates the separation of the indigenous owners, their knowledge of resource use, and kinship laws with impunity. In his book, 1835, the historian James Boyce associates the founding of the city of Melbourne with the systematic transformation of Birrarong and the extensive networks of waterways that it sustained, including lakes, lagoons, swamps, grasslands, marshlands, and billabongs. Radically different from what is left of it today, Birrarong was as much as 90 meters wide, with saline tidal flows, ensuring that the upstream of the rocks could be a permanent source of fresh water. In the 2 decades that ensued, the reliance on sheep as the focus of farming meant that the wetlands were left as a refuge for the landless and the poor. But once property speculation began in earnest, the wetlands were drained with ruthless efficiency, leaving current-day Melbourne a pale reflection of its pre-colonial ecosystem. Aileen Moreton Robinson's book, The White Possessive, is very significant here. She connects the ontological and performative function of turning land into property during the years of the frontier wars and its role in relegating the indigenous owners to property-less subjects exposed to practices of incarceration, removal, and extermination that were validated by regimes of common law. All right? So property development warranted not only the transformation of waterscapes, but also a large-scale intervention into marine ecologies. Crucially, oyster shells were sought and burnt in massive quantities to generate lime, chemically known as calcium oxide, that provided the supply of mortar for the colonial building industry. Early settlers collected large amounts of oyster shells from coastal middens, that is, indigenous shell deposits, or directly from natural oyster beds, and burned the shells in kilns or open fires to produce quicklime. The chemical compound was then mixed with water and sand to create lime mortar and plaster, material for constructing stone or brick buildings for rendering walls. The numerous lime kilns and related place names, such as Lime Burners Bay and Lime Burners Lagoon, and flattened oyster reefs in the region, are faint remnants of large oyster shell aggregations in Port Phillip Bay and across various sites in Queensland as well. oyster shell creeps into some of the first accounts of invasion as well. In his diary dated 29 May of 1835, John Batman relays entering the Port Phillip Bay on board of Rebecca. He reports sighting an Aboriginal village populated with marine villas, and next to it a structure of mussel, he says, mussel, unio, and periwinkle from the large number of empty shells which lay in heaps around. End of quote. While this is the only reference to shellfish as a food source in his journal, Batman's world teems with an obsession with lime. He reports sighting a schooner from Port Sorel and then befriending two lime burners, he says, and he refers to them as his mates, his friends, the lime burners. And so the lime burners mentioned to Batman that there was, quote, there was a fine tract of land opposite the hut on the other side of the bay. And later, the same people assist him in catching fish and various other chores. The oyster in Batman's diary is an aphoric entity. The shell pokes at his deep ignorance and the absence of any genuine curiosity about middens as architectural sites built over thousands of years, and yet constantly present as the species that can scaffold the building of the settlement. The oyster encapsulates the invasion, the massacres, and the environmental destruction at the heart of the larger project of turning land into property. The Kwandumuka artist Megan Cope has worked with middens in her practice in a number of projects since 2016. Cope's engagement with the shell middens operates as a complex articulation of memory, materiality, and sovereignty. Through her reconstruction of midden forms using cast shells, mineral sands, and industrial residues, Cope transforms these ancient accumulations of sustenance into sculptural testaments to the endurance of indigenous cultures in the face of environmental disruption that coloniality brought about. Works such as Reformation and Foundations juxtapose the organic geometrics of shell mounds with the rigid order of the colonial grid, exposing how extractive industries and urban expansion have both consumed and concealed indigenous architectures of place. In later installations like Whispers Middens, sorry, I don't have images for that, the midden reemerges as a living participatory structure, part monument, part acts of communal repair, and thereby reinstates the oyster shell as a vessel towards reclaiming ecological balance and cultural continuity. In this way, the midden renders a critical form through which histories of disposition, resilience, and renewal are materially reimagined. Cope's marine archaeological work found its uncanny parallel in an oceanic phenomenon in 2022, when several oyster beds were exposed by the shifting sands following the tidal breakthrough in the Pommy-Sistone Passage, the channel that separates Bribie Island from mainland Queensland. Once the center of a thriving oyster industry between the late 19th and early 20th century, the passage sustained numerous leases to many companies and individuals, including the ones to Moreton Bay Oyster Company, the biggest company that was involved in extracting oyster, in farming and extracting oyster in the region. The reemergence of these long-held buried beds is a reminder of the Sunshine Coast's intertwined natural and industrial histories, as you can see in some of these images. It underscores how coastal landscapes function as living archives, material witnesses to exploitation, ecological fragility, and the cyclical relationship between environmental transformation and cultural memory. Melissa Lukanchenko comes to some of these questions in her latest novel, Eating Glassy. And I would like to end with this novel. The book covers the two ends of the history of Magunjan Brisbane, starting from 1840 in Kurilpa village and continuing to 2024 in West End, Brisbane, and Niagara country. The title points to a brief period when settlers called the new town Eden Glassy. The narrative begins only 2 years before the closure of the Moreton Bay penal settlement, located on the north bank of the Brisbane River, the establishment that paved the way for the construction of Brisbane town in the years that followed. The alternating temporalities adopted in each chapter effect an archaeological revisionism that peels back layers of urban structures sedimented on top of pre-colonial waterways. On the one hand, the land is transformed by the colonial settlement. On the other, as the protagonist Granny Eddie Blanket, the 103-year-old Guri elder, notices from her hospital bed overlooking the city, the land remains untransformed, continuously Yagara country. She ruminates, the world was like it always was, and yet different. In the background, the Queensland state government is busy dreaming up the bicentenary celebrations of the arrival of a cutter, of a small ship called Mermaid, headed by John Oxley, Surveyor General for the colony of New South Wales, who was tasked to find a site for a new penal settlement, one that could house reoffending convicts of the worst types, they thought. Oxley followed the path taken by the explorer Matthew Flinders in his circumnavigation of Australia in 1801 to 1803. Most of Oxley's journal, titled Report on an Expedition to Thomas Brisbane, the governor of New South Wales at the time, concerns the finding of fresh water with the conclusion that the Redcliffe Point could be the location for the Moreton Bay settlement on Turrbal and Niagara land. In his journal, Oxley notes the abundance of marine life and the very numerous population of indigenous owners. He uses the phrase very numerous, noting in passing humility their most friendly disposition, he says, and their sophisticated, quote, domestic habits, without ever mentioning indigenous law over land. Oxley was consulting the map drawn by Matthew Flinders. As Paul Carter suggests, the settlement imaginaries are mediated in the dialogue between the explorer and the surveyor as the two dimensions of a single strategy for possessing the country. While the explorer's aim was always to travel on, the surveyor always had it in mind to stop. Against the explorer's high road, the surveyor was an advocate of fertile basins, conceptual places where the imagination might be enticed to settle. End of quote. Settlement then becomes the project that manifests in the long, laborsome gap between colonial invasion and habitability, one that requires constant overwriting of the land and its waters in maps, journals, and reports, and an incessant interrogation of country for administrable data. Granny Eddie is woven into a contemporary iteration of a similar cartographic logic by Dartmouth, a journalist who is commissioned to write a sensationalized report about the oldest First Nation person for a show that involves the arrival of a replica of Mermaid on the Brisbane River, sporting the companionship of the centenarian elder and the state governor. Reenacting Eddie's generous vision of an Australia that recognizes colonial domination in hindsight, implied in Eddie's generous vision of an Australia that recognizes Aboriginal sovereignty, but remains open to a future of country where the owners and the settlers can share the nation in peace. The show for reconciliation is a practice run for the opening ceremony of the 2032 Olympic Games. So in these ways, it's very contemporary and at times very humorous too. One of the things that it is denying, though, this whole show, is the ongoing violence of urban development in suppressing waterways that threatens to break into the concrete surface. In her hospital room, Eddie is visited by a ghost who carries the knowledge of the violence of frontier wars, of abductions, of stolen children, and massacres, one being of his own family. The spectral presence is of Malanin, Eddie's ancestor, a saltwater Ugamba man who travels to the Moreton Bay for an indigenous ceremony, falls in love with Nita, an Ngoge woman who is in service of a prominent settler family, and later is brutally killed as he is trying to escape the jail for an following an unjust allegation. Until the end of the novel, Malanin is mistaken as Eddie's grandfather, a colorful man and a storyteller. But the ghost also carries a memory of Magunjin's waterways from a more distant past, before it was completely overlaid by concrete. At some point, he interjects, "Albert Street was buggy in the early days." The ghost reflects, "There was a marsh there once, crab, eels, yabbies. We fished a lot." And Eddie passes this on to the journalist. "Eels in Albert Street. You're writing this down, Darto? People gotta hear this." Melanian's voice sheds a different light on Brisbane's ordinary urban life, as if the mud under the concrete is going to surge through the pavement at any moment, and rightly so. It was only at the turn of the 19th century that the drainage of the settlement of Kurilpa village ended after almost 4 decades of draining the wetland. Complaining to a local newspaper in 1890, one resident quipped whether anyone knew that the street was a quagmire or a swamp, or whether any other description can be given of it. The novel holds a mirror to the urban archaeology of South Brisbane of the early settlement that is changing rapidly, with more strangers coming on every tide, as Malanin reflects at some point. And with this invasion, there is a sense of wholesale diminishment of marine life and First Nation livelihood. The destruction feels like a curse, as Dewalbin, another elder in the novel, ponders. The fish in the Warrar grows scarce, child, and it's smaller. You mustn't tempt fate. Did ye hear the bribey oyster banks are ravaged? The Duggai took far too much, took the oysters by the barge load and burnt the lot alive, over and over again, season after season, simply to use the shell for lime. Such incredible waste. And now the banks are ruined. Lukashenko does not leave us there, though. Not in despair, but rather in hope for justice and revival of country. The novel ends with an Aboriginal young couple taking Malanin's skull on a ship called Eden Glassy into the river and up into the Moreton Bay. The last words are uttered by the elder himself, addressing the bodies of water as kin and as agents of repair. And you island countries stretching low in the east, oh my friends, I know you so well. Do you know me? Do your waters run black with a mullet still? Does the sea eagle soar above the shoal? Do the coastal people net dugong off your beaches? I greet you, dear friends, all showing me the path to its south and home. I see you too, Wollongong, perched on the western horizon. And is that, can it be, the matriarch swimming beneath us? Yes, I see you, old one. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Keyvan. That's given us that's been quite a journey across so many different places on top, underneath. This is going to be a moment now for us to ask any questions or discussions. I've got a page full of notes that can serve us well, but I would like to invite anybody else who is joining us online this afternoon if they have any questions or comments for Keyvan. Might be a discussion between you and me, Keyvan, for a few minutes.
Yeah,
Uh,
go for it.
I was uh, I was struck by the descriptions of waterways that have been covered or cemented over, and it's even more meaningful for me in these last couple of weeks because I've been teaching Tony Birch's Ghost River.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and the idea of deep time is one that's really important for that novel. Um, but I'm so I'm also thinking about that river and the evidence of the eels continuing to follow that same pathway. Um, There's also another book that you reminded me of when you were talking about Melbourne. So two books. One of them is Tony Birch's Ghost River, and another one is a book that was edited by one of our previous visiting fellows, Rose Michael, called Composite City, in which there is an essay uh, about oysters as well in Melbourne. I'm not sure if you're aware of that Composite City. It might be one that,
I'll
and
look it up.
yeah. Um, but if I would ask you a question about does that the idea of deep time that comes up in Ghost River in particular about there being a river underneath the river that many people who occupy spaces are unaware of. Does Ghost River, will that be another text you would bring into the conversation that you're having here?
Absolutely. And I'm ashamed to say I haven't read that one by Tony. Thank you so much. I'll look it up. Very, very important. And you're precisely right about that. It's sort of just that kind of realization shifts the perspective a little bit of what we see and what is actually there under our feet, and the kinds of different sorts of histories that um, that these two ways of seeing can give us. In Lukashenko's novel, Melissa's novel, towards the end, it finds very literal um, form. That sort of a spectral presence of the elder on the ship sailing into the Brisbane River. There's this conversation between a young couple who are also on board, and they're steering the ship, a young First Nation couple. And they're wondering whether the ghost sees the same thing. Um, and it is suggested that the spectral presence, the ancestor, sees Eden Glassy all the time where there was the potential for history to go either way, for the settlers essentially to be pushed back out of current day Brisbane. Um, so that's what he sees. And then the spectral presence, the ancestor, has this sort of kind of dialogue with country, with the water bodies in general. that is something about sort of that deep time. But of course, you know, there's sort of inherent futurity in the deep time. The idea that um, uh, only country will last. So all will go, but country will last. Country will be here, always been and will be here. Yeah.
Yeah, so I have uh, reply and say to my shame, I haven't read Eden Glassy yet, although it is on my shelf at home to be read. Um, uh, it is a uh, like an interest, like the idea of cement that came up a couple, or concrete, that term concrete came up quite a number of times in the discussion, and I think it's going to reflect now my reading of Eden Glass when I get to it, because I having grown up in southeast Queensland, I'm aware of all of those creeks that once flowed through down all of the ridges of Brisbane, and they're still there. I mean, that's the point, isn't it? They're still there underground, running through pipes and conduits or whatever else has been constructed. But then and I have Tony. So your recommendation to me is Melissa Lukashenko's Eden Glassy. Mine is Tony Birch's Ghost River. That the importance of story in
Yeah.
in all of these conversations that we're having. That's the one thing about Ghost River, that the knowledge of this pre-settlement history, the knowledge of deep time, is something that we can only get through those stories that have been handed down to our present day First Nations peoples, wherever they might be.
Absolutely.
The invitation is still open to anybody else in the room to offer any comments or questions. This is the start of your day in Jena, isn't it,
It, it,
Kayla?
it is. It is. 4:30 your time is 7, and I I think you guys had um, a, a shift just lately for daylight saving, and we had one here as well. So all of us sort of kind of stretched the time difference between us a bit longer.
Yeah.
So yeah, so the sun is up, but when I left home, uh, it was dark. Yeah.
So I can see Elizabeth's hand is up, but I also have a message from Vincent Backhouse, who's been listening to the presentation. He's going to reach out to you. He has another commitment to go to. So as you rightfully said, there are going to be um, uh, um, asynchronous engagements with your talk, because the recording will be there for others. And I was afraid that daylight saving was going to affect us here, because it is, when we talk about place and time, that idea of standard Australian Eastern Standard Time is one that trips people up a bit. But Elizabeth's hand is up, so Elizabeth, I'll invite you to. Yes, there she is.
Hello, I thought I'd better come online. I was just conscious that you began by saying about the blue humanities in the Northern Hemisphere, and then reflecting on scholars in the Pacific responding to that. And I was just curious through, I guess, your conversations there, because you are in the Northern Hemisphere.
Yeah.
And your experience being here, and you're obviously dwelling on some of these stories of the Southern Hemisphere. How do you feel that injection of sort of Southern Hemisphere perspectives into conversations there? What impact does it have? How do you feel it changes people's understandings or outlook?
Thank you, Elizabeth. I think this sort of this emphasis on feeling is that's exactly the thing. It's difficult. Last semester I taught a subject on Pacific literatures, and sort of I worked a lot for myself, but also with my students with Theresa Tai, with the late Theresa Tai, was essays. She started the first Pacific Studies program at the University of Wellington in New Zealand, and she has her way of explaining some of these sort of difficult positionalities. And she talks about how difficult it is to actually teach the Pacific meaningfully in the classroom. And she talks about the classroom as a canoe and all those kind of very, very productive metaphors. But I had to start with that a lot in the classroom for myself, certainly for myself, and it stays with me, that kind of difficulty. But also for my students to reflect on this, that we are here in Central Europe and we're not in the Pacific. And then the moment that we're involved in sort of the kind of the scholarly imagination, the research imagination, there is a problem to reckon with. And this is nothing new. I gave some of those quotes. Yeah, since the 70s, Pacific scholars have warned against these kinds of approaches. I suppose approach is the term. But the enthusiasm remains, I think, from the center towards the region. And I'm kind of seeing myself in that kind of difficult dynamic, coming from the globalist perspective towards the regional perspective. And I think that needs to be acknowledged. And I kind of I wanted to stay with that and see what happens. Yeah.
If I can just add my bit to that, it's interesting. So the other challenge that you've given us is the idea of region as just that as a useful term, and I'm thinking of the other work that you've done with the other author whose name I'm not going to be able to remember, your book that's coming out. So there are these oceanic regions that set themselves up for comparison. Yes, you're in the northern hemisphere, but there are also oceans there, oceans as region, which must provide like fruitful comparison. I wonder if you'd sort of speak a little bit about that other book that's coming out of yours and how that might have influenced the positions you're taking in terms of ocean as a region or waterways as regions. I just wrote down the idea of oceanness and riverness and creekness in all of those waterways, that they all have these certain qualities or attributes no matter where they are. There are some things that are similar, but then the particular locations give them a particular resonance. So I wondered how your work across these different literatures then might impact.
And you're entirely right about that, Roger. I mean, there is the idea of the ocean, and there is this sort of the difficulty that rises with that immediately. What to do with a place, how to get to understand the idea of the region, and how to do research in an embedded way, in a place-based way. So that was also a challenge with that book. So that book sort of takes the idea of Waterborne method in a more kind of in a more sort of liberal and open way. And so I've worked with sort of 4 elements that are in some kind of dialogue with water. One of them is mold, for example, air, and water in the air, humidity in the air that creates mold, and inside some of the residential buildings that migrants and refugees from um, um, Jamaica and some from Eastern Africa in Gurna's novels. They end up in these sort of residential houses in various cities in England after the Windrush generation of 48. So then I have this sort of natural phenomenon of this growth of mold in the house as something that has to do with humidity, has to do with water. So that's what I call sort of a material ecology of water. And the ways that sort of that has to do with the sort of production of disadvantages, material disadvantages of these sort of migrant characters. And in some novels that he wrote in the 80s. In other chapters, I work with other kind of natural phenomena that have to do with they're waterborne in one way or another, right? But again, challenge there was to understand that kind of history, that kind of place that I was writing about, and it comes down to a series of experiments, I suppose, and it may it may not work, you know. So this is what I'm saying. One of those things I think with new materialist thought, it's an experiment, and you gotta go with it. But it may or may not work. Yeah. But the more you understand the place, the better, I suppose. Is it? Yeah.
Click microphone and my voice will work. Yes. Mold is on our minds at the moment here in North Queensland as we approach summer and the increase in humidity. I think it was warm when you were here, Keyvan, but we're really stepping up the heat and the humidity at the moment. There are all of these connections, which makes what we do really interesting. I think this might be a moment where we can call time on our meeting this afternoon. Elizabeth, if you can see the chat, Keyvan, Elizabeth has dropped in another Deb Wardell's Subterranean Imaginaries and Groundwater Narratives. Another recommended reading from the group that you might find useful.
Thank you.
But I would like to thank you for getting up early in the Northern Hemisphere to speak to us this afternoon. It was really good to have you here. It's really good to be able to continue these conversations in this way, and really generous of you that we'll be able to have this recording for others to see it asynchronously as well. Thanks, Keyvan. As Elizabeth knows, if you were here, we would be taking you out for a post talk drink. We're unable to do that, so if I can just encourage you or invite you to have whatever beverage is going to be refreshing for you in the morning time in Jena, please do so, and think of us while you're having that refreshment. Thanks, Keyvan, once again. I look forward to the next time when you come to visit us here in North Queensland.
Likewise, Raja. Thank you so much for having me today.